The night I stopped being a daughter was the coldest November night in Toledo. Snowflakes drifted down in lazy spirals, and the porch light cast a pale yellow glow over the cracked steps. I still remember the sting of antiseptic in the air from my stepmother Linda's cleaning spree earlier that evening. She liked everything spotless, every fork aligned, every rug vacuumed in stripes. What she hated was me. At 19, I was nothing but a reminder of the marriage my father lost and the mistake he now believed he carried in his own house. The pregnancy test shook in my hand. I thought I had hidden it deep enough under the bathroom sink, but Linda had radar for secrets. She burst into my room with the thin strip clenched between her fingers like a guilty verdict. Her eyes were ice, her lips tight as wire. Pregnant. 19. Her voice came out sharp. Whose shame are you trying to plant under my roof? Before I could speak, her hand struck and her nails dug into my arm. I stumbled back, protecting my stomach by instinct. She pushed harder, fury building. Then came the moment that seared itself into my bones. She twisted my wrist and shoved until a white-hot crack tore through me. I screamed, the sound swallowed by the walls that had never sheltered me. My father Richard stood in the doorway, his tie still neat from work, his Bible under his arm from evening service. He did not move toward me. His face was stone, his silence louder than any words. Linda spat, "You are not my daughter anymore." Then my father added the line that has haunted me for 2 decades. "You made your bed, now lie in it." My knees buckled. The world spun. Pain radiated from my arm down to my spine. I collapsed against the porch step, the icy concrete biting through my jeans. Snow settled on my hair as if to bury me alive. Jason, my half-brother, lingered in the hall with a smirk. He held up his phone as if filming a comedy sketch. His laugh echoed as I crawled onto the driveway, clutching my belly with one good arm. The front door slammed. The lock turned. I stared at the porch light. It had always been the signal for welcome home when I was little. Tonight it glared like a spotlight of judgment, a reminder that I no longer belonged. My breath came in ragged clouds. The night pressed in on me silent, except for the throbbing in my arm and the hiss of wind through bare branches. That was the moment my old life ended. At 19 and pregnant, I was exiled from the people who should have protected me. I did not know where I would sleep, how I would eat, or if I would even survive the winter. But I knew one thing as I stumbled away from that porch light. I would never forget. I would never forgive. And if I ever found the strength, they would see me again not as the broken girl they discarded, but as something they could never crush. Before that November night, I had already lived 19 years in a house that looked picture perfect from the street, but felt like a prison once the door shut. Our home in Toledo sat on a quiet block with trimmed hedges and a white church only 2 blocks away. Neighbors waved at my father Richard when he left for Sunday service in his pressed suit. They called him a pillar, a man of God, the kind who quoted scripture at potlucks and shook hands like he was sealing a promise. What they never saw were the shadows stretching long in our kitchen after the hymns ended. My mother had died when I was young. For years, it was just me and Dad, a lonely pair, but a pair nonetheless. He remarried when I was 10. Her name was Linda Carter, and to the congregation she was a blessing, a woman who kept a spotless home and baked pies for every fundraiser. To me, she was a storm in human form. She believed in control the way others believe in love. From the start, she corrected the way I sat, the way I spoke, even the way I chewed my food. "A lady does not slouch," she said while shoving my shoulders back. "Do not laugh so loud, it is unseemly. Wear longer skirts, people are watching." Every word was a rule, every glance a judgment. The house smelled like lemon polish and fear. My father rarely interrupted. If Linda told me to scrub the floor again after homework, he said nothing. If she made me skip a youth group outing because I had left one dish in the sink, he nodded like discipline was holy. I learned early that silence could bruise deeper than words. Then came Jason, Linda's son from her first marriage. He was 3 years older, smug, tall, and quick, with a cruel smile. He had her approval sealed in his pocket like a golden ticket. He could spill orange juice on the rug, and she would laugh it off, but if I left one book on the couch, she'd snap at me until tears blurred the page. Jason learned quickly that mocking me earned him extra praise. He called me charity case, called me stray. sometimes muttered bastard when Dad was not in earshot. Linda never stopped him. Sometimes she smiled as if cruelty proved loyalty. I carried my books tight against my chest at school and kept my head down at home. Even so, I held a piece of hope tucked away, small and stubborn. I dreamed of college, of building a life far from the Carter rules. By 17, I had a part-time job at the library downtown, saving every dollar. My father said nothing about my future unless it was to remind me that college was for boys who carried the family name. Then I met Ethan Walker. He was different kind in ways that startled me. He was from the next town over, worked summers at a hardware store, and dreamed of the Navy. He listened when I spoke, really listened, not like Jason, who only waited for me to slip. Ethan made me laugh at the diner one night until I forgot to be careful. He said he would write to me from boot camp at Great Lakes, that one day he would come back in uniform and we would leave Ohio behind together. For the first time, I let myself imagine escape. That was when the test strip changed color in my hand. I remember staring at it in the bathroom, the vent fan whirring above me, the floor tiles cold under my feet. I knew what it meant, even before the line finished darkening. My hands shook, but my heart was strangely calm. I thought maybe, just maybe, this would be the start of a different kind of family. Ethan never got the chance to know. He had already shipped out to training. His letters stopped after a while. Maybe he was too young. Maybe he was scared. I told myself I would manage alone. I had survived Linda's rules for nearly a decade. I could survive this. What I did not know was how fast the secret would unravel, or how violently Linda would react. The house that looked so polished on Sunday mornings was nothing but a cage once you lived inside its walls. Linda cared more about what the ladies at church whispered than about what her own stepdaughter felt. She liked to parade us in the pews as if we were the perfect blended family. Richard at her side with his Bible, Jason standing tall in his pressed shirt, and me forced into modest dresses 2 sizes too big so I would look small, obedient, unnoticeable. I learned to sit with my knees together and my hands folded, but inside I burned with a quiet defiance. I memorized the cracks in the church ceiling, anything to avoid her constant glares when I shifted in my seat. At home, things were sharper. Linda's voice carried through the hallways like a warning bell. She kept a ledger in her head of every mistake I ever made. If Jason spilled milk, she laughed, saying, "Boys will be boys." If I left a textbook on the table, she accused me of being lazy, ungrateful, a disgrace to the Mitchell name. My father never argued. He said keeping peace was more important than choosing sides. But his silence always felt like betrayal. It taught me that I could not count on him. Jason thrived in that environment. He followed me around the house with his phone recording when I tripped, or when Linda scolded me later, showing me the clips with a smirk. "Look," he would say, "even Dad thinks you are pathetic." He flexed the approval of both parents like a weapon. I grew skilled at shrinking into corners, skilled at keeping my voice low, skilled at surviving. I thought maybe if I endured long enough I could escape. College was my secret plan. I kept brochures tucked under my mattress and scholarship forms folded in notebooks. But then Ethan came, kind and full of dreams bigger than this town. He made me laugh until my stomach hurt. He told me about the Navy and about traveling, about salt air and freedom. For the first time, I imagined a life where I was not the stepdaughter in the shadow, not the scapegoat of someone else's broken marriage, but simply Sarah, young and free. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought it might be the key to leaving. Ethan never knew. His letters slowed, then stopped. I told myself he was busy, told myself he would come back. I whispered to the life inside me that we would be fine, that love was enough, that I would protect us. But secrets do not survive long in Linda's house. One mistake was enough. I left the test strip in the trash can wrapped in tissue, but she found it. I should have known she would. She sniffed out weakness like a hound. The night she stormed into my room holding that tiny piece of plastic between her fingers, I knew the storm I had feared for years was about to break. Her eyes burned with something more than anger. It was fury laced with humiliation, as if my existence had ruined the spotless reputation she guarded so desperately. She shouted words I can still hear in my nightmares. Shame, disgrace, worthless. She spoke like the walls themselves needed convincing that I had defiled her home. Jason stood behind her grinning phone raised recording as if my pain was a prize he could hoard. My father arrived moments later, his Bible under his arm, his face hard. For 1 second, I thought he would step in, that the man who once read me bedtime psalms would protect me. But his eyes were flat, his jaw clenched, and when Linda's hands lashed out when pain exploded in my arm and I collapsed, he did nothing. His words came out steady cold. "You made your bed, now lie in it." The final nail hammered into the coffin of my childhood. The neighbors never knew. On Sunday morning, we still lined up in the pews, smiling for the congregation, but inside that house, a family had already chosen to throw me away. The night Linda discovered the truth was already cold before she laid her hands on me. Toledo winters have a way of cutting through the thickest coats, and that evening the wind pressed against the windows like an uninvited guest. I sat on my bed with a notebook open, trying to calculate how many shifts at the diner it would take to pay for baby supplies when Linda's sharp steps echoed down the hall. The door slammed open. She stood there holding the test strip like a blade, her lips curled into a sneer. Pregnant at 19, she hissed, as if the words themselves were filth. She marched across the room, her perfume of lemon and starch filling my lungs. Her hand shot out, gripping my wrist, twisting it until pain flared white-hot. I gasped and tried to pull back, but she only tightened her hold. Her face was inches from mine, eyes wide with rage, mouth spitting accusations. "You will not ruin this family. You will not drag our name through the dirt." The crack came before I even understood what she was doing. A scream ripped from my throat, raw and broken. Pain shot up my arm, radiating into my chest. I stumbled, clutching my belly with my free hand, terrified that the shock would hurt the life inside me. My father appeared in the doorway. He set his Bible on the side table, as if this were just another family discussion. His eyes flicked to my arm, bent at a wrong angle, then back to Linda, but he said nothing. My voice shook as I pleaded, "Dad, please." His expression hardened. "You made your bed, Sarah. Now lie in it." The sentence hit me harder than the injury. It was the final confirmation that there was no safe place in this house, no father to protect me. Jason appeared behind them, his phone raised. He laughed quietly, as if this were a scene staged for his entertainment. "Don't come crawling back," he muttered, grinning like victory had already been secured. Linda dragged me to the front door, her grip merciless. She flung it open, and the night air slapped my face. Snowflakes drifted down, glowing under the porch light. I stumbled onto the steps, falling hard against the concrete. Pain lanced through my arm again, but I cradled my stomach, whispering to the baby inside that I would not let them win. The door slammed shut. The lock turned with a final click. And there I was, 19 pregnant, arm-broken breath fogging in the freezing air, staring at the same porch light that once meant home, but now burned like a spotlight of shame. The cold sank into me as if the night itself wanted me gone. My fingers trembled, useless against the pain radiating from my arm. I pressed it close to my chest, rocking slightly, whispering to the tiny heartbeat inside me that we would keep moving. I remember staring at the snow piling along the driveway, thinking how quiet the street was. Neighbors' windows glowed with soft yellow light. Families inside, sharing supper laughter muffled by walls that actually sheltered. Not one curtain shifted to check on the girl crumpled outside her own house. I pushed myself to my feet with the strength of desperation. Each breath cut sharp in my lungs, but I refused to collapse again. The porch light behind me threw a long shadow ahead, stretching like a road I had no choice but to take. I turned away from the house. Every step down that gravel driveway was an act of exile. I could almost hear Jason laughing behind the curtains, Linda satisfied with her control, my father silent in his chosen righteousness. I clutched my stomach tighter, whispering that we would survive this night, even if I had no idea how. By the time I reached the street, snow coated my hair, my shoes soaked through my teeth chattering. I had no coat thick enough for this weather, just a thin jacket that did little against the wind. The street lamps flickered, casting weak halos on the empty road. I kept walking, the ache in my arm, pulsing with every heartbeat. I thought of turning back, of banging on the door until someone opened, but the memory of my father's voice stopped me cold. "You made your bed, now lie in it." Those words were a wall higher than any locked door. I would not give them the satisfaction of watching me crawl. My legs carried me to the bus station downtown. The glass doors slid open with a wheeze, and the blast of lukewarm air felt like a miracle. I sank onto a plastic bench, wrapping my good arm around myself. People passed by without stopping. A man in a heavy coat read a newspaper. A woman juggled 2 children and a suitcase. No one looked at me long enough to see the truth. I closed my eyes, willing myself not to cry too loudly. Tears would only draw stares, and stares would turn to whispers. In that moment, I understood what loneliness really meant. Not the absence of people, but the presence of people who did not care. I sat there until my body stopped shaking enough to think. I told myself over and over that this night would not kill me. It might scar me, it might change me, but it would not end me. I had a life inside me, a reason to keep breathing. And as I sat in that sterile bus station, 19 years old, arm broken, abandoned by my family, I made a silent vow that one day the world would see me not as the girl left outside in the snow, but as someone who had walked through fire and come out unburned. The bus station became my first shelter. I sat hunched on the hard bench until the announcements blurred together and the janitor swept the same patch of tile again and again. My arm throbbed, swollen and angry, but I was too scared to go to the hospital. I imagined Linda telling the police that I had fallen, Jason showing his video with the sound cut just right, and my father nodding with that steady voice of authority. Who would they believe, the deacon and his polished wife, or the girl who had just been thrown out pregnant at 19? So I wrapped my arm with an old scarf and told myself it would heal even if the ache never left. The nights stretched endless. I walked the city streets until dawn, looking for warmth wherever I could. I pressed my face against laundromat windows just to catch the heat from the dryers. I sat on church steps and whispered prayers I was not sure anyone heard. I counted my money, a few wrinkled bills and coins, and realized I would have to find work before hunger hollowed me out completely. That was how I stumbled into Tony's Diner downtown, the kind of place where the neon flickered and the smell of grease clung to your clothes. I asked for any job, even if it was just washing dishes. The manager looked at me with tired eyes, then handed me a rag and told me to start wiping tables. My first shift blurred with the clatter of plates and the sharp ring of the cash register. Customers never looked twice. Men in work boots ordered coffee. Mothers tried to keep kids quiet. Teenagers lingered over fries. To them, I was invisible, just another girl clearing ketchup bottles. My back ached, my feet blistered, but I stayed until closing because the few dollars in tips meant I might afford a sandwich the next day. At night, I wandered back to the bus station. I curled up in the corner seat, trying to keep my arm still whispering to the baby that we would get through. I remember one night in December when the snow was heavy enough to silence the streets. I sat on the bench outside the station, shivering so hard my teeth hurt, and for the first time I thought about giving up. Maybe Dad was right. Maybe I had made my bed and misery was the blanket I deserved. Then a woman appeared, maybe in her 60s, with kind eyes and a scarf wrapped tight around her neck. She did not ask questions. She sat beside me, opened her thermos, and poured steaming tea into the cup lid. "Honey," she said softly, "God never wastes pain. I will never forget those words." They pierced through the fog, through the ache, through the cold. I drank the tea and felt warmth spread through me like a small promise. That moment became a seed. I told myself if a stranger could see me as worth sitting beside, then maybe I was not finished yet. After that night with the stranger and her thermos, something inside me shifted. I still had nothing more than a handful of tips and a jacket too thin for Ohio winters, but I carried her sentence with me like a hidden ember. God never wastes pain. I repeated it while scrubbing plates at the diner, while wiping down counters long after the last customer left, while walking back to the bus station under a sky so wide it made me feel small and temporary. Slowly, I began to piece together a fragile routine. The manager at Tony's let me pick up extra shifts. Sometimes I worked mornings, sometimes nights, but I always stayed until my feet burned. I saved every dollar I could, hiding them in a coffee tin under the bench where I slept. The first time I had enough for a week's rent, I found a listing for a studio apartment in a crumbling building near the river. The walls were stained, the heater coughed more than it warmed, and the bathroom sink leaked into a rusted bucket, but it was mine. I stood in the doorway that first night and whispered to my belly. We made it. It was not luxury, but it was shelter, and the door locked from the inside. I bought a thrift store cot, a blanket with faded flowers, and a chipped mug for tea. Every item felt like a victory. My broken arm healed, crooked, but it healed. I wrapped it tight and worked through the ache, determined not to fall behind. The pregnancy advanced, and with every kick, every flutter, I found another reason to keep moving. I began walking to the public library on my days off. There, I discovered pamphlets about community college and financial aid. I filled out forms with shaking hands, not knowing if anyone would ever read them. I told myself education might be my ladder out of the pit I had been pushed into. Some days, despair pressed heavy on me. I remember one evening trudging home after a double shift, snow soaking my shoes, exhaustion pulling me down. Couples passed me carrying shopping bags, families laughing on their way to Christmas gatherings, and not one of them saw me. I collapsed on a bus stop bench and cried until my chest hurt. I wanted to disappear, but then I pressed my hands to my belly and felt a kick, strong and insistent. It was as if the child inside me was reminding me I was not alone. That moment steeled me. I wiped my face, stood up, and walked back to my apartment, whispering a promise that no matter what it cost me, I would give my daughter a life different from mine. Those early months taught me survival in ways no sermon ever could. I learned to stretch a rotisserie chicken into 3 meals. I learned to sew a button with dental floss. I sold plasma twice a month when the gas bill came with its red stamp. And every morning, no matter how tired I got up, poured weak coffee into my chipped mug and told myself, today we keep going. The winter I turned 19, I stood at a crossroads. My baby was due in just a few months, and every decision I made felt like a stone that would either build our foundation or crush us completely. I had survived the nights on benches and the ache of hunger. I had found a studio with peeling paint and a cot that creaked every time I shifted. But survival was not enough. I wanted more than to scrape by. I wanted to stand tall in a way my stepmother could never have imagined. One afternoon at the library, I stumbled across a flyer tacked to the bulletin board. It advertised scholarships through the Reserve Officers Training Corps at the University of Toledo. The paper was smudged, the edges curled, but the words leapt off the page. Tuition covered. Leadership training. A future in the Army. I stood there clutching the flyer, feeling a spark I had not felt in years. Could someone like me, a girl with no family with a crookedly healed arm, with a child on the way, really walk onto a campus and into a program that forged leaders? I almost threw it away, convinced it was meant for someone else. But the voice of that stranger with the thermos returned. God never wastes pain. Maybe this was what she meant. I applied with trembling hands, filling in blanks about my grades, my work history, my goals. I wrote about resilience, about surviving nights in bus stations, about wanting to give my child a life that did not begin in shame. I mailed the envelope and waited whispering prayers over every letter I dropped at the post office. Weeks later, a letter arrived. Acceptance. I read it twice, then a third time, my heart pounding. It felt impossible, but there it was, in black and white. I was about to step onto a path I had never dared to imagine. Training was brutal from the start. Physical training at dawn classes stacked one after another, long hours studying maps and history while my body ached from pregnancy. I showed up in worn sneakers patched with duct tape. My arm still stiff from the break years earlier, my endurance weak. The first run left me gasping at the back of the formation, tears stinging my eyes as cadets surged ahead. For a moment, I considered quitting. But then I remembered the porch light and my father's voice saying I was no longer his daughter. Rage and shame mixed into fuel. I took another step, then another. I refused to stop. That was when I met Gunnery Sergeant Walt Harris. He was retired, a broad-shouldered man from West Virginia who volunteered to mentor cadets. He saw me struggling one morning and pulled me aside. "Ma'am," he said with a crooked smile, "discipline starts where you stand." He handed me a folded Post-it note with a list scrawled in block letters, push-up progressions, interval runs, how to tape a blister. It was simple advice, but it was the first time an adult outside of the diner had looked at me as if I was capable. I taped that Post-it to my wall and read it every morning. Slowly, painfully, I improved. I woke before Dawn left Emily with a neighbor who watched her for a few dollars and ran until my lungs burned. I showed up to classes even when my body begged for sleep. Each week, I fell a little less behind. Each month, I grew a little stronger. I still remember the day I passed my first PT test. My arms shook, my legs trembled, but when the final number was called, I had done it. I walked home grinning for the first time in years. That night, I baked an apple pie with the last of my tips and left it on Sergeant Harris's table at the diner where he sometimes ate. He tipped me $5 and gave me a grin that lasted longer than the pie itself. Emily was born in that cramped apartment with paint peeling from the ceiling and the radiator clanking like it might quit any moment. I had no family by my side, no father pacing the hallway, no stepmother to whisper encouragement. Just me, a midwife from the clinic downtown, and the strength I did not know I still carried. When Emily's tiny fingers curled around mine for the first time, I whispered a promise I would spend the rest of my life keeping. We will make it, just you and me. Those early months blurred into a haze of diapers, midnight feedings, and dawn marches. I carried her in one arm and textbooks in the other. My body was stretched thin, but every time I looked at her, I knew quitting was not an option. The ROTC program became more than training. It was structure, a place where the rules were clear and effort meant reward. Nobody cared about my last name. Nobody cared that my stepmother had thrown me into the snow. They cared if I showed up on time, if I could lace my boots correctly, if I pushed through one more rep even when sweat stung my eyes. The uniform gave me something I had never had at home, a sense of belonging. I remember staring at myself in the bathroom mirror the first time I wore it. Shoulders back, chin level, hair pinned tight. For a moment, I didn't recognize the reflection. This was not the broken girl who had crawled off a porch with a shattered arm. This was someone new, someone becoming steel. Balancing motherhood and training nearly broke me. There were days I missed Emily's first giggles because I was memorizing land navigation points in a fogged-up classroom. There were nights I collapsed on the floor, too exhausted to climb into bed. But every sacrifice carried weight, a weight that built muscle in places I did not know existed. When Emily was 3, I applied for officer commissioning. The essay asked for an example of resilience. My hands shook as I typed about the bus station bench, about the thermos of tea, about the night I swore I would never crawl back to the porch that cast me out. I wrote about shame turned into fuel, about pain turned into determination. I printed it at the library for 10 cents a page, slid it into an envelope, and prayed. The letter of acceptance arrived one spring afternoon. Emily sat on the floor coloring with a stubby crayon cartoons buzzing in the background. I opened the envelope and stared at the word accepted until the letters blurred. Tears slid down my face, not the broken kind, but the kind that come when a door cracks open on a future you thought was locked forever. I pulled Emily into my lap and told her, "We can have anything now." She smiled like it was already true. Training as a commissioned officer was harder still. We rose before the sun marched in rain that soaked through every layer studied maps until the numbers swam. During one ruck march in August, rain poured so hard it felt like judgment itself. My boots filled with water blisters blooming with every step. I thought of my father with each mile. Instead of breaking me, the memory propelled me. One captain sharp-eyed and steady fell into step beside me. Finally, he said quietly, "You've got more in you than you think." I carried that sentence like a medal. By the time I pinned on my first rank, Emily stood beside me in a thrift store dress, clapping like the ceremony was made just for us. And in a way it was. We had walked through fire, through cold, through silence, and still we stood. When I commissioned as a second lieutenant at 22, I stood straighter than I had in my entire life. My uniform was crisp, my hair pinned tight, and Emily clapped from the front row in her blue dress Ruth Jennings had found at a yard sale. That moment was the first time I allowed myself to believe we were no longer just surviving. We were climbing. Yet the reality of being a brand new officer and a single mother was nothing like the polished photo pinned to the fridge. The Army did not bend its schedule for bedtime stories or fevers. My first assignment at Fort Benning tested me to the core. Early mornings began with formations while Emily still slept. I dropped her at daycare before the sun was up, whispering apologies into her hair. Some nights, I did not see her until after she was already tucked in by a neighbor. Guilt became a permanent shadow. I felt it every time she asked if I could stay home, and I said no every time I signed another late slip for daycare. Yet I pressed forward because each day in uniform was another brick laid in the life I promised her. I threw myself into training. Land navigation, tactical planning, weapons qualification. Every test was a battlefield between the voice of my father telling me I was unworthy and the voice inside me that whispered I could prove him wrong. On one field exercise, I remember slogging through mud up to my shins, rain pouring into my eyes, and still pushing forward because I refused to be the girl who had been laughed out of her own home. I was leading a squad for the first time, terrified they would see the doubt beneath my confidence. But when we completed the mission on time, one of the sergeants gave me a nod that said more than words. That nod carried me for weeks. Money was always tight. My lieutenant's pay barely covered daycare rent and groceries. I sold plasma again a few times when winter bills stacked too high. I stretched every dollar until it screamed cooking spaghetti 3 nights in a row and calling it tradition so Emily would laugh instead of worry. She never complained. She only hugged me tighter and said she liked it best when we were together. Those early years were full of small failures and hard lessons. I missed her first steps because I was stuck in the field. I forgot to sign a permission slip for a school trip and saw the disappointment in her eyes. Yet I also taught her resilience. She watched me lace my boots every morning and asked if she could have laces just like mine. She learned early that strength was not something you were given. It was something you practiced. Looking back, those years carved both of us into something harder, something sharper. The Army tested me. Motherhood tested me. But together they built a foundation stronger than any porch light or slammed door could ever tear down. By the time I pinned on first lieutenant, I had learned that the Army would never hand out respect easily. It had to be earned in mud, in sweat, in decisions that could break you if you hesitated. My assignment at Fort Hood, now called Fort Cavazos, was the crucible where I learned this truth. Texas heat was relentless. The air itself felt heavy, pressing down with each march across the training grounds. I was placed in charge of a platoon, men and women older than me, some who had served longer than I had been alive. I saw skepticism in their eyes during our first briefing. To them, I was a skinny 24-year-old single mother trying to sound like a leader. Inside, my stomach twisted, but I refused to let it show. I remembered Linda's voice dripping with disdain, my father's silence, Jason's laughter. Every ounce of doubt they had poured into me, I now channeled into determination. I showed up before dawn, triple-checked every plan, and stood in the heat until sweat stung my eyes. Slowly, grudgingly, their skepticism faded. It was replaced by something I had not expected: trust. Trust came the day I stood up for one of my soldiers who was about to be disciplined unfairly. I presented the facts clear and steady, even when a senior officer glared at me like I had overstepped. My soldier walked away with a fair decision, and my platoon looked at me differently after that. They saw I would not abandon them even under pressure. Balancing the role of officer and mother only grew harder. Emily was starting kindergarten, and she needed more than quick hugs at drop-off and late-night lullabies when I stumbled home. There were mornings I dressed her in the back seat of the car, hair still tangled, while reciting my operations brief out loud. There were evenings I sat in the bleachers at her school play, still wearing my uniform boots, dusty from the field. Guilt gnawed at me, but Emily smiled as if my presence, however imperfect, was enough. By 28, I earned the rank of captain. The ceremony was small, the applause brief, but for me it was monumental. Captain meant command. Captain meant leading not just a platoon, but an entire company. With the new rank came deployment orders overseas. I kissed Emily goodbye at the airport, her small hands clutching mine until the last moment. That was the hardest separation I had ever faced. I carried her drawings in my rucksack, each crayon line a reminder of what I was fighting to build. Overseas leadership hardened me further. Decisions carried weight that echoed beyond paperwork. Lives depended on clarity, on steadiness. I learned to trust my instincts to listen when seasoned sergeants spoke to admit when I needed help, but never to falter when eyes turned to me. Those years stripped away any illusion of weakness. I was no longer the broken teenager on a snowy porch. I was Captain Sarah Mitchell, and the world had no choice but to acknowledge it. By the time I reached the rank of major in my mid-30s, the weight of the uniform pressed heavier than ever. Promotion meant recognition, but it also meant distance. Distance from Emily. Distance from the version of myself that once measured success in small steps rather than stars on a shoulder. I was assigned to the Pentagon for a 2-year rotation serving in logistics and planning. From the outside, it looked like Triumph crisp uniforms in marble hallways, meetings in conference rooms where maps of the world spread across polished tables. But the reality was a constant battle between the clock and my conscience. Emily was in middle school by then, living with me in a cramped rental near Arlington. Every morning I left before sunrise and often returned long after she had eaten dinner. She grew quieter, more independent, as if she had learned early that her mother belonged to two worlds, one that tucked her in at night and one that demanded every ounce of attention during the day. I missed birthdays. I missed her first piano recital. I tried to make up for it with weekend trips, late-night talks over fast food promises that when this phase ended, we would have more time. But the Army never truly gave more time. It only gave more responsibility. I told myself the sacrifice was building her future, but guilt still gnawed at me. Professionally, the major years tested me in ways no field exercise ever had. I was responsible for planning logistics for units overseas, calculating supplies that could mean the difference between success and disaster. Mistakes here were not measured in points lost on a test, they were measured in lives. The pressure tightened around my chest with every signature I gave. Yet it was in this crucible that I learned the deeper meaning of leadership. Leadership was not just standing tall in front of a formation. It was sitting across from a staff sergeant who had lost a friend and listening without rushing to fill the silence. It was staying late to check numbers one more time, even when my own daughter waited at home. It was admitting when I did not have all the answers, but refusing to stop until I found them. Emily once asked me, "Mom, why do you always look so serious now?" I had no easy answer. How could I explain that every decision I made carried echoes beyond my own life? All I could do was pull her close and tell her that seriousness was how I kept my promises to her and to the people who depended on me. The rank of major gave me authority, but it also carved deeper scars of absence. It taught me that success often demands a price, and the bill is usually paid in moments you cannot get back. Still, I pressed forward because every star I climbed toward was not for me alone. It was for Emily, for the life we were still building together. When I pinned on Lieutenant Colonel at 40, the ceremony felt both proud and bittersweet. Emily stood beside me in a navy dress, her hands trembling as she attached the silver oak leaves to my uniform. She was a teenager then, poised, but with eyes that carried all the weight of years spent waiting for me to come home. The applause echoed through the hall at Fort Bragg, but what mattered most was the way she smiled through her nerves. That moment was hers, as much as mine. The responsibilities of a lieutenant colonel were heavier than any rucksack I had carried in training. I was entrusted with overseeing operations that stretched across states, managing not just soldiers, but their families, their futures, their hopes. Every decision rippled outward. I spent long nights bent over maps and endless spreadsheets, the clock ticking past midnight while my daughter studied in her room down the hall. Sometimes we worked in parallel silence, her scribbling math problems while I calculated supply chains. Other times, she would bring me tea, sit across from me, and quietly ask, "Do you ever get tired of being strong?" I never knew how to answer. I wanted to tell her yes every day, but instead I told her that strength was not about never being tired. It was about showing up anyway. At 45, I earned the rank of colonel. The promotion came with fanfare, a packed hall, and speeches about leadership and honor. They called me general material, a phrase that both lifted and burdened me. Recognition brought with it a sharper spotlight, and the higher I rose, the less room there was for error. I commanded a brigade, thousands of soldiers looking to me for clarity. When crises came, I had to stand steady even if my own heart pounded. In those years, Emily was finishing high school, applying to colleges. I missed her senior prom, her acceptance letter ceremony moments I had dreamed of sharing. I tried to be present where I could, cheering from the stands at her debate finals, helping her pack for Harvard, with hands that still trembled from late-night briefings. She once told me, "Mom, I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to be here when you can." Those words steadied me more than any medal. Colonel was both recognition and burden. The stars above me seemed close enough to touch, yet they came at the cost of miles walked without my daughter's hand in mine. But I pressed forward because each rank was not just my story, it was ours. Every sacrifice was proof that we had endured, that the porch light of shame had been replaced with the steady glow of achievement. When I was 50, I stood inside the Pentagon once more, but this time not as a staff officer hurrying between meetings. This time I stood at the center of the hall with a single star pinned to my shoulder, Brigadier General Sarah Mitchell. The weight of that title pressed on me with a force I could not have imagined when I was a 19-year-old girl shivering on a porch with a broken arm. The ceremony was formal, filled with dignitaries, officers, and old mentors. Yet all I could see was Emily in the front row wearing a simple blue dress, clapping until her hands were red. She had graduated from Harvard by then, poised and confident, her smile steady as she looked at me. I thought about the nights she had fallen asleep waiting for me to return the school plays I had missed, the birthdays celebrated through static phone calls from across the ocean. All of it had led to this moment. When the applause faded and I stepped to the podium, I spoke not about medals or strategy, but about survival. I told them leadership begins not in victory, but in the nights when no one believes in you, when silence cuts deeper than words. I spoke about resilience, about refusing to let shame define you, about finding strength in the cracks where life tried to break you. My voice shook, but I did not hide it. Those listening needed to hear that even generals are made of scar tissue. Afterward, as the crowd mingled and cameras flashed, Emily slipped her arm through mine. "You did it, Mom," she whispered. I corrected her. "We did it. That star belonged as much to her as it did to me." In the days that followed, my name appeared in articles, my face in official photographs, but none of it mattered as much as sitting with Emily on the quiet evenings after the noise faded. We would share tea, laugh about small things, and let silence settle between us, not as absence, but as peace. The journey had been long and brutal. It had carved away parts of me I could never regain, but it had also built something indestructible. I was no longer the girl defined by rejection. I was the woman who had stood back up again and again until the world had no choice but to recognize me. Brigadier General was not just a rank. It was a promise fulfilled, a legacy sealed, and a signal that the cycle of silence and shame had finally been broken. It had been more than 20 years since the night I was thrown out into the snow, but the memory lived sharp inside me, a scar that never fully faded. By the time I wore the star of a brigadier general, I thought I had built a wall so high that no echo of that house could reach me. But family has a way of finding cracks even in walls made of steel. The first letter came from my father's church back in Toledo. I almost mistook it for a formal invitation until I read the words inside. Richard Mitchell was ill. Terminal, they said. His wife and stepson had been the ones to pass along the message, as if sickness could erase the years of silence and violence. I set the paper down and let the silence of my office swallow me. For a long time, I told myself I would ignore it. The man who had turned his back when I needed him most did not deserve the courtesy of my presence. The woman who had broken my arm and thrown me into the night did not deserve to look at me in uniform. And Jason, who had laughed while recording my humiliation, deserved even less. But life is not simple, and duty does not only exist on battlefields. A week later, they arrived at Fort Bragg unannounced. I was in my quarters reviewing logistics reports when Albert, my retired sergeant turned aide, knocked gently. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, "there are visitors asking for General Mitchell. They claim to be family." My chest tightened the air, leaving me in one sharp breath. I told him to let them wait at the gate. When I walked down the long gravel path, my boots crunching in rhythm with my heartbeat, I saw them. Linda stood stiff, her hair streaked with gray, but her posture still sharp, as if she had rehearsed this moment. Jason hovered beside her, heavier, now his once smug face drawn with lines that spoke of disappointments he would never admit aloud. And my father. My father sat slumped in a wheelchair blanket across his knees, his eyes clouded with sickness but still carrying the same silence I remembered from my youth. Linda spoke first, her voice trying to be steady. "Sarah, General Mitchell. We came because your father is dying. He wanted to see you." The sound of her calling me General was strange, like poison coated in honey. Jason looked at me with something between awe and resentment. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but I raised my hand and cut the moment short. "This base is not your church. It is not your living room. You stand here because I allow it, not because you are owed it." The soldiers at the gate shifted, watching their eyes flicking between the decorated general and the strangers who dared call themselves family. For the first time, Linda did not have control of the room, or in this case, the entire parade ground. She swallowed, lips pressed thin. Jason muttered, "We just want to talk." I felt the weight of every soldier's eyes. I thought of every night I had bled and struggled to climb here, every tear Emily had shed while waiting for me, every mile I had run with the memory of their cruelty as fuel. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then I leaned closer, my voice steady enough to cut glass. "You broke my arm. You left me in the snow. And now you stand at my gate asking for entry. Tell me why I should not turn my back the same way you turned yours." Their faces paled, and for once it was them who had no answer. The silence hung heavy between us, broken only by the distant hum of a chopper overhead and the faint clang of weights from the training field. For once, Linda's sharp tongue failed her. Jason shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the soldiers stationed nearby as if their presence magnified his shame. My father coughed, his shoulders trembling under the blanket. His voice, weak but still familiar, finally filled the air. "Sarah, I just wanted to see you before." He stopped, breath rattling. I studied his face. This was the man who had quoted scripture to everyone else but offered me none when I was on my knees in the snow. Now he looked small, almost frail, the authority stripped away by illness. I felt no rush of sympathy, only the dull recognition that time spares no one. Linda stepped forward, her voice brittle. "We were wrong. Things got out of hand back then. We need to make things right before it's too late." Her words cracked on the edges, not with sincerity, but with the desperation of someone who knew her mask was slipping. Jason finally blurted, "We didn't know you'd become this. A general. Everyone talks about you." His eyes darted to the star on my uniform, then back to the ground. "We thought, maybe you'd want family again." I let out a sharp breath, almost a laugh. "Family! You say that word like it was ever yours to give." My voice rose firm and unyielding, carrying across the gate so that every soldier within earshot could hear. "You broke me. You left me. You made sure I understood I was nothing in your house. And now, you come here to mine because you think my name, my rank, my life might offer you something." Their faces burned with the truth laid bare in public. I saw soldiers exchange glances, their respect for me deepening not because of my star, but because I dared to speak aloud the kind of truth most families bury. Jason muttered, "We just want a chance. I cut him off. A chance is what you took from me at 19. My words sliced clean. Linda's shoulders sagged, her mouth tightening as if to swallow her pride. My father closed his eyes, whispering something I could not hear. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps nothing at all. I straightened my shoulders. "I am not the girl you cast out. I am General Sarah Mitchell, and you stand here not because I need you, but because you need me. Remember that." The soldiers at the gate stiffened, their respect clear in their posture. Public humiliation. This was the justice I had carried for 20 years. Linda's eyes glistened. Jason looked down, and Richard let out a cough that seemed to drain the last of his strength. I turned to Albert and said simply, "Escort them out." As they were led away, the gate closed behind them with a metallic clang that echoed like a verdict. My chest rose and fell, heavy but steady. I had not forgiven, not yet, but I had spoken the truth aloud, and the world had heard it. In that moment, the porch light that once cast my shame had been replaced by the floodlights of a base where respect was earned, not stolen. The official reception was held in a wide hall at Fort Bragg, decorated with flags, polished floors, and rows of tables lined with officers, their spouses, and community leaders. I had walked into many rooms where eyes followed me, but that night felt different. This was my home turf, my world, and every person present knew the weight of the star on my shoulder. Emily stood by my side, radiant in her green dress, her pride shining brighter than any medal I had ever worn. The hum of conversation stilled when Albert approached me with a tight expression. "Ma'am," he whispered, "your family? They've come inside." My chest tightened, but I did not flinch. If they wanted to intrude here, let them. Let the truth be spoken where the world could hear it. The crowd parted slightly as Linda, Jason, and my father entered the hall. I watched as whispers rippled through the room. Some officers recognized the names from my file. Others simply noted the tension etched in my face. Linda wore her usual mask of composure, though her eyes darted nervously under the bright lights. Jason shifted in his ill-fitting suit, looking out of place among the pressed uniforms. My father was wheeled in pale and weary, his presence silent but heavy. They walked, or in my father's case, rolled straight toward me. I stood tall Emily at my side, the conversations around us fading into silence. Linda smiled faintly, the kind of smile she used to wear at church socials. "Sarah," she began, her voice strained, "we only want to honor you tonight. Your father is proud. We are proud." The hypocrisy clanged louder than any cymbal. My jaw tightened. Proud. I repeated the word, tasting bitter. Proud of what? That I survived what you tried to destroy, that I carried the scars you gave me and turned them into strength. Or proud because now my name is printed in newspapers and you want to stand in the reflection of my star. Gasps echoed through the hall. Officers exchanged looks, spouses leaned closer, the tension alive in the air. Linda's composure faltered. "We made mistakes," she stammered, but I raised my hand. "Mistakes are forgetting an anniversary. Mistakes are burning dinner. You did not make mistakes. You broke my arm. You threw me into the snow when I was 19 pregnant and begging for mercy." The words hit like a hammer. Jason's face turned red, his jaw working as if he wanted to object, but no sound came out. Linda froze her mouth, opening and closing, every eye in the hall fixed on her. My father coughed weakly, his voice a rasp. "Sarah, please. This isn't the place." I leaned closer, my voice steady enough to silence even the murmurs in the crowd. "This is exactly the place. For 20 years you kept the truth behind closed doors. Tonight the doors are open. Everyone will hear what you did." Emily's hand slipped into mine, her grip firm, anchoring me. I felt the eyes of generals, captains, civilians, all watching, not as a scandal, but as a reckoning. And for the first time in decades, it was not me who stood accused. It was them. Linda's mask cracked under the weight of silence. Her painted smile faltered her eyes, darting left and right as if searching for escape. Jason shifted his stance, sweat beading at his temple. For the first time, the audience of officers and neighbors, the same kind of people she once worked so hard to impress at church, saw her without polish. "Sarah," she whispered, "I never meant for it to go that far. I was scared ashamed. I thought I was protecting the family." Her voice quivered, but there was no sincerity in it, only calculation. I straightened my words sharp as a blade. "Protecting the family. You broke a 19-year-old's arm and locked the door behind her. You called cruelty protection. You called abandonment love. Don't dress it up now." A low murmur rolled through the hall. Officers who had fought wars shifted uncomfortably because they understood the truth of scars. Jason finally found his voice blurting out, "You don't know how hard it was for me either. I had to live in that house too." I turned to him, letting the silence stretch until he squirmed. "Hard for you," I said slowly. "You recorded me crying in pain. You laughed while I bled. You weren't a victim. You were an accomplice." His mouth opened, then closed. The shame on his face said more than any argument. My father's weak voice rasped through the stillness. "Sarah, forgiveness is what the Lord commands. I am dying. All I ask is forgiveness before I go." The words pierced something in me, but not in the way he expected. I took a breath, steadying the storm inside. "You want forgiveness, but when I begged for mercy, when I asked for protection, you gave me silence." You chose reputation over your own child, and now you ask me to do what you never did." The crowd was hushed, every eye locked on us. I felt years of swallowed pain rise like a tide. I did not shout, but my words carried with the weight of truth. "I will not lie for your comfort. You abandoned me. You left me to freeze. You gave me nothing, and I built everything without you." Linda's shoulders slumped. Jason stared at the floor. My father closed his eyes. And then something unexpected happened. Applause. It started small from a corner of the hall where a sergeant stood, then grew as others joined in. Soon the hall was filled with the sound of hands meeting in rhythm, not for the fall of my family, but for the triumph of truth. Emily squeezed my hand, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "Mom, they finally see you." I looked out at the sea of faces, comrades, friends, strangers, and felt a wave of release. For 2 decades, I had carried the weight of silence. Tonight, I had spoken. Tonight, the burden was no longer mine. Linda wiped her eyes. Jason muttered something about leaving, and my father slumped further in his chair. They had come seeking dignity, but they left with nothing but exposure. And I, General Sarah Mitchell, stood tall in the light. No longer the girl in the snow, but the woman who had survived it faced her demons and won. When the applause faded, the hall settled into an uneasy quiet, as if everyone sensed that the confrontation was not yet complete. I looked across the room at the 3 people who had defined my childhood in chains: my stepmother Linda, my half-brother Jason, and my father Richard. They sat exposed before a community that now knew the truth. Linda's face was streaked with ruined makeup, her posture stiff but trembling underneath. For years, she had ruled with fear, her voice sharp as glass, her fists quicker than her words. Now, in front of soldiers, neighbors, and strangers alike, her reign had collapsed. She whispered I was wrong, but her voice was so faint it dissolved in the air. Jason shifted uncomfortably, his bravado gone. He had always been the one who basked in her favor, who mocked me with smirks and cheap cruelty. Yet under the lights of truth, he looked small. His jaw clenched as though grinding down the bitter taste of recognition. He muttered, "I was just a kid. I didn't know better." I fixed him with a steady gaze. "You knew enough to laugh when I screamed. You knew enough to lock the door." My words hung heavy, and Jason's face crumpled not into repentance, but into shame that no excuse could wash away. My father, though, remained the still point of the storm. He leaned on his cane, his skin pale and stretched thin, his eyes carrying the cloud of illness. For years he had been my phantom judge, his silence on that November night louder than any curse. Now he raised his head and met my gaze. "Sarah," he said, voice cracked but deliberate, "I failed you. I see it now. I thought sternness was love, but it was cowardice. I should have stopped her. I should have pulled you back inside. I cannot undo it." He paused, his breath rattling. "But I beg for one chance to say I am sorry, truly sorry as your father." My chest tightened, old wounds pressing hard against new strength. Part of me longed to hear those words decades earlier before the scars had formed. Another part wanted to shut him out forever. I stood in that ache, torn between the girl who once wept on a bus bench and the general who now commanded men and women across continents. The hall was silent, waiting. Soldiers who had faced death in deserts and mountains leaned forward as if this moment mattered as much as any battle. Finally, I spoke. "I do not forget, Richard. I will never forget. But forgiveness is not a gift you take. It is a truth you must live in." His shoulders sagged and tears welled in eyes I had only known as hard. For the first time, he looked not like a pillar, but like a man broken by his own choices. The power had shifted forever, and everyone in the room knew it. Linda broke the silence with a sudden sob, clutching her purse as if it were armor. "I lost everything, too," she cried. "My marriage, my reputation, my peace. Do you think I do not suffer?" Her words fell flat, echoing against walls that had just witnessed the weight of truth. The officers and neighbors exchanged looks, unimpressed by her plea. I answered calmly, not with rage, but with clarity. "Suffering does not erase cruelty. You chose the path that left scars on me. You broke my arm, and you broke my trust. Whatever you lost afterward was the consequence of your own hand." Linda covered her face, the sobs turning into shallow breaths, not because of remorse, but because she could no longer manipulate the room. Jason, usually loud and mocking, sat silent. His head hung, his fists clenched on his knees. For once, he had no performance to give. I remembered him smirking at the porch that night, recording me in pain. Now no phone could shield him from shame. "Jason," I said quietly, "you wanted me gone then. Look at where it led. You followed cruelty and it gave you nothing. You wanted a sister gone. You got a family broken." He looked up briefly, his eyes red-rimmed. "I can't undo it. I was wrong. It was not enough. It never could be. But it was a crack in the wall he had built, and in that moment I let the silence sit instead of filling it." My father cleared his throat, voice trembling but firmer than before. "Sarah," he said, "you speak of truth first, then forgiveness. I cannot ask you to pretend the past was different. But if there is room, even the smallest, I wish to spend what years I have left trying to mend what I shattered." His words struck a chord in me. They did not absolve him, but they acknowledged the wound without excuses. That was more than I had ever expected. I took a deep breath, my voice low but carrying. "I will not erase the past for your comfort, but I will not let it chain me anymore either. I can choose to forgive without forgetting. That choice is mine, and I make it now not for you, but for me, for Emily, and for the life I built beyond your shadow." Gasps rippled through the hall, not at the cruelty, but at the freedom. Forgiveness, spoken aloud, was not weakness, it was strength. The applause returned softer this time, reverent like the closing of a hymn. Emily pressed her hand into mine, her smile fierce and proud. "You did it," she whispered. My eyes stung, but I kept them steady. In that hall, under the gaze of community and comrades, I felt the chains finally fall away. My stepmother wept. My brother shrank, my father bowed his head, and I, Sarah Mitchell, stood unbroken, not only in uniform, but in spirit. The truth had been spoken, and the verdict was no longer theirs to give. It was mine. The reception wound down slowly, as if the room itself understood the weight of what had just unfolded. Plates clinked, conversations hummed in low tones, and yet an invisible current of reverence lingered. I stood near the mantel where photographs of my journey were arranged, snapshots of a life that had begun in exile and ended in command. My hand brushed over the frame of a younger me in uniform, the bar on my chest glinting faintly under the lights. That photograph, once a private treasure, was now a public testimony. Emily joined me, her presence steady as always, her hand slipping into mine. She leaned her head slightly toward me and whispered, "They saw you, Mom. Not just the general. They saw everything." Her words carried a truth I had long hoped for, but rarely admitted aloud. For decades I had defined myself by discipline, by endurance, by the relentless pursuit of something beyond pain. Tonight I realized that all those battles, both on parade grounds and in silent kitchens, had led to this moment of being truly seen. Across the room, my father sat slouched, weary but quiet. Linda kept her distance, her sobs having dwindled to the occasional tremor, while Jason stood stiffly by the door as though unsure whether to flee or to endure. I let them be. The reckoning had already happened. Their silence was its own kind of sentence. What mattered now was not their remorse or lack of it, but the freedom I had claimed. Neighbors approached in small groups, offering words that landed gently like blessings. "You've given us courage. Your story will stay with me. Thank you for telling the truth." Each phrase was a balm, though I accepted them with humility. I knew the road had been paved not by speeches but by nights of exhaustion, by calloused hands and lonely prayers whispered into the dark. My strength had not been forged in applause, it had been forged in silence. Later, as the last guests departed and Albert closed the front door behind them, the house fell into a rare stillness. The winter air pressed against the windows, muffling the world outside. I walked into the sitting room where my family remained. Emily followed, her chin lifted in quiet resolve. My father looked up, eyes weary but searching. "Sarah," he said softly, "we are not worthy to ask for your forgiveness. but I hope someday we may earn the right to stand near you without shame." I considered his words carefully. The man before me was not the one who had turned his back decades ago, yet he bore the weight of that man's decisions. "You will not undo the past," I said evenly, "but you can choose what you do tomorrow. That is where worth is built." My stepmother shifted uncomfortably, her lips pressing tight, but for once she did not speak. Jason finally lifted his head, his voice brittle. "Do you think we have a place in your life?" I thought of the years they had erased me, the holidays I had spent in solitude, the milestones they had never witnessed. Then I thought of the community that had carried me, the mentors who had guided me, the daughter who had given me purpose. "A place exists," I said slowly, "but not on your terms. If you come in truth. No lies, no rewriting. That is the only way forward." The words hung in the air like a new command, one even I had not realized until they were spoken. Emily glanced at me with pride, her eyes shimmering. She had grown up with a mother who carried scars but also carried resilience. Now she saw what it meant to draw boundaries without bitterness. My father nodded, his shoulders lowering in acceptance. Linda stared at the floor lips pressed thin, her silence betraying a war inside her. Jason whispered, "Understood," though his voice trembled. It was not triumph I felt in that moment, but release. For the first time in decades, I no longer needed their acknowledgement to validate my life. I had already built it. I had already won. That night, after they left under Albert's watchful eye, I walked through the quiet house. Emily padded beside me, carrying 2 cups of tea. We sat together on the back porch, the cold air stinging our cheeks. The stars stretched wide above Fort Bragg's dark silhouette. Steam curled from our mugs, rising into the night like prayers. Emily broke the silence first. "Do you feel lighter now?" I let the question rest on my heart before answering. "Yes," I said, my voice calm. Not because they changed, but because I spoke. The truth once spoken releases its weight. Emily nodded, her smile small but knowing. "Then you've already won twice." I chuckled softly, the sound surprising even to me. For so long, laughter had been rationed. Now it returned like an old friend. I looked at my daughter, no longer the child who clutched my uniform sleeve, but a woman with her own strength, and realized that my story was not only mine. It was hers, too. The world may have cast me out, but together we had built a life that no rejection could dismantle. And in that realization came peace, not fragile or fleeting, but enduring. The morning after the reception dawned pale and clear, the kind of winter light that makes everything sharp. I rose, early years of military discipline still etched into my bones, and found myself standing before the framed collage Emily had hung in the hallway. 3 images stared back at me, the girl of 19, bruised and broken on the porch, the young officer clutching her commission letter with trembling hands, the general in uniform, shoulder-square daughter at her side. It was not a boast. It was a record. A ledger of what truth, endurance, and mercy could build. Emily patted down the stairs, hair-tousled mug of coffee in her hand. She paused beside me and smiled softly. "It's all there, Mom. Every part of you." Her words stirred something deep. For so long I had tried to lock away the pain, to separate the girl from the woman, as though survival required erasure. But here it was woven into one story. Not broken chapters, but a whole. Later that day, I sat at my desk to write 3 letters. The first was to my father. I did not soften the words. I wrote plainly, "You abandoned me, and it carved scars that will never vanish. But you confessed, and confession matters. If you wish for peace in your last days, then live the truth, not the lie." The second was to Jason. I told him that cruelty hides behind excuses, and he must choose whether to remain small or grow honest. The third was to Linda. It was the shortest. "You cannot control me anymore. The hold is broken." I sealed the envelopes not as invitations, but as markers of clarity. They would know where I stood. That evening, Emily and I took a walk around the base. Soldiers saluted, neighbors waved, and I nodded back, each gesture a reminder of the community I had found beyond blood. "You built a family here," Emily said, gesturing at the rows of houses, the chapel where voices rose on Sundays, the schoolyard where children ran. She was right. Family is not only who shares your name, but who shares your burdens, who shows up when life grows heavy. That truth, once invisible, now glowed with certainty. As we turned back toward our home, I asked her quietly, "Do you ever wish we had been spared the hard road?" Emily's answer was swift. "No, because the hard road gave me you." Her eyes were fierce, and in them I saw every reason I had fought, endured, and risen. That night we prepared for the holidays. The tree was modest, decorated with ornaments collected from postings across the country and overseas. A clay star from a craft fair in Georgia, a wooden angel from Germany, a tiny boot stitched by a neighbor in Texas. Each piece carried a memory, not of loss, but of survival. When the first snow began to fall, Albert brought in logs for the fire, his quiet presence steady as always. He paused at the door and asked, "Ma'am, shall I mark the ledger differently?" After last night, I considered, then nodded. "Yes, Albert, mark it reconciliation in progress. Not completed, not certain, but in progress." He smiled, closed his book, and went about his duties. Progress that was all any of us could claim. On Christmas Eve, Emily placed 3 envelopes by the door, not the ones I had written, but new ones addressed in her looping hand. For Grandpa. For Uncle Jason. For Grandma. Inside each envelope she had placed a photograph of us together and a single sentence. "Family isn't who never fails you, it's who tries again." I asked her why she did it. She shrugged gently. "Because if we want them to change, we have to leave the door open a crack." I let her not, because I trusted them, but because I trusted her. The next day, as laughter and carols filled the house, I realized that healing does not arrive as a banner. It arrives in small choices repeated over time. The choice to speak truth, the choice to set boundaries, the choice to forgive without forgetting. As night fell and the candles flickered low, I stepped onto the porch. The snow stretched endless, quiet, and clean. I thought of the 19-year-old girl left shivering in the cold, clutching her broken arm and her unborn child. If I could speak to her now, I would say, "Hold on. You will rise. You will build. You will not only survive, you will command. And one day, the world will call you general." I breathed deeply, letting the cold fill my lungs, and whispered into the night, "I am free." Then I turned back into the warmth of the house where Emily waited, where truth had set its foundation, where the story continued. If you have followed me this far, you know this story was never only about pain. It was about what comes after, about how one act of cruelty cannot define a life unless you let it, about how broken beginnings can lead to unshakable strength, and about how family is not the ones who cast you out, but the ones who stand beside you when the storm rages. If you have ever been left out in the cold by people who should have sheltered you, hear me, you are not finished. Your life can still be built brick by brick, choice by choice, until one day you will look back and see not the wound, but the strength it gave you. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope. Subscribe, stay, and walk with me into the next chapter. There are more truths to tell, more reckonings to witness, and more plates to set at the table of redemption. Because no matter where you begin, you can choose where you stand.